Welcome. Do you think the world is running out of oil and the scarcity will force us into using clean, renewable energy? Well, dream on. Beneath the sea, there is a substance called methane hydrate, which by some estimates is twice as abundant as all other fossil fuels combined. Not only would this crystalline natural gas multiply global warming, it would alter the world's economy profoundly. We'll get to this in a moment. Also today, in our public intellectual segment, we'll hear about a study indicating how racial inequality persists even when there is no racism. Later, we'll question the need for all those high-tech worker visas. Some argue that plenty of Americans are available for work in science and engineering. Companies just want cheap foreign labor. All this, plus later we'll find out which online company protects us best from the long arm of the law. Facebook, Google, Apple, or Twitter? There's a small hint to my left. First, methane hydrate. It's not a pipe dream. The Japanese are already at sea prospecting for this frozen gold. Science writer Charles Mann knows all about it. He wrote the cover story in the current Atlantic magazine entitled, "We Will Never Run Out of Oil." He joins us via Skype from Massachusetts. Hello, Charles. Welcome to the program. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk about the science first and then the political ramifications. What exactly is methane hydrate?
Well, sediment, organic sediment, comes off the edges of the continents and lands in the sea. And as it percolates down to the bottom, it's eaten by microorganisms, just the way the stuff at the bottom of ponds is eaten by microorganisms. And sometimes when you walk past a swamp or something, you'll see little bubbles of gas coming up. That's the methane produced by those microorganisms. Under the sea, though, when the water is cold enough and the pressure is high enough, that methane doesn't escape to the surface. Instead, it effectively reacts with the water and produces this stuff called methane hydrate. And there's bands of methane hydrate that go all the way along the coastlines of most of the world.
All the way along the coastlines of most of the world. That's such an important part of this, and I'm going to bring up a map that's in the Atlantic as part of your article. And so we're looking at this basic map of much of the Earth, the Atlantic and Pacific rims, with yellow dots and white dots. And I guess the yellow dots are places where methane hydrate has already been recovered. And the white ones are, which I know appear as blue in the magazine, but they look like white on the TV screen, are places where it's believed to be found. In other words, it seems to be along practically every coast, every shoreline of every country. Is that as significant as it looks to me like it might be?
Yes. Now, presumably most of that, for one reason or another, won't be recoverable. But there's so much of it that even if only a small amount is actually recoverable, a small part of a big number is still a very big number. And you're looking at a tremendous potential energy resource.
So, for example, if so much of foreign policy has been based on maintaining access to oil exports from the Middle East, if we're going to find this source of fossil fuel energy along our shores, and most countries can find it along their shores, then it seems to have, a huge potential ramification for global geopolitics.
Absolutely. Much of the world economic growth depends on a secure supply of energy. And until quite recently, that's effectively meant oil from the Middle East and a few other places like Venezuela and Nigeria. And what this is suggesting is that many, many nations have the potential to loosen that kind of collar around their necks that's imposed by their dependence on oil from the Middle East. And Japan is a big example. It's the world's second biggest economy, and it produces something like 1/1000th of its own petroleum. To the Japanese, the idea of not sending every year billions upon billions of dollars to the Middle East is a highly attractive prospect.
And what would it mean for the United States in particular?
Well, actually, for the United States, it might mean a little bit less than it would mean for other nations like Japan and China and India, to name only a few of the countries that are very interested in methane hydrate. And the reason is that we have enormous supplies of natural gas already from fracking, from the kinds of what's called shale gas. And so already a variety of pundits have suggested that we might become effectively energy independent in the next 10 or 15 years, possibly by 2035 at the outset. So we don't really need it as much if we're looking about energy independence as Europe, Asia, and Africa.
But I'm confused about at least one thing.
Mm-hmm.
The cover of the magazine poses the question why we may never run out of oil, something like that, but with oil in the title. And now we seem to be talking about natural gas deposits below the ocean. So is it oil or is it natural gas?
It's mostly natural gas. The magazine editors decided that oil was sort of a stand-in for petroleum, and petroleum was too long a word to put in big letters on a cover.
So whether it's natural gas or whether it's oil, it's a petroleum product?
Yeah, we're talking about fossil fuels.
And what are the
And
global warming implications? Because I know there's a big debate in this country raging right now over fracking and whether the natural gas that we get from fracking or the process of fracking itself adds as much to global warming as extracting oil does, or whether this actually reduces the carbon load, which many scientists say has been happening as we frack more and use less oil.
we certainly are emitting less carbon dioxide. We're down to roughly 1992 levels. And a principal driver for that has been the substitution for coal, which produces a whole lot of our electricity, substituting that with natural gas. And a lot of that gas comes from fracking. Now, the downside of that is twofold. First, the process of getting the natural gas releases some of the natural gas is mostly methane, and the process of getting it releases some of that methane into the air. And methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And so there's a fear that even if just a little bit of it leaks out while we're getting it, it'll cancel the benefits of natural gas, which burns and emits roughly half as much carbon dioxide as coal. And the other problem with it is that natural gas, even though it emits much less than coal, still emits a lot of carbon dioxide. And the hope has been that by many environmentalists that this belief is that we're running out of oil, we're running out of gas, and that's going to force us into clean energy. And I guess my article is kind of saying, no, it's not going to be the case. We're going to have a lot of this stuff. And if we're going to switch to clean energy, it's going to take a concerted effort. The market's not going to push us there.
And yet, one of the impediments seems to be that a lot of this stuff is, as you say, about 6 miles below the surface of the ocean, and it's in frozen form. So how expensive is it to get it out of there?
Well, right now it's quite expensive because the whole process is just beginning. The Japanese say it's 3 or 4 times the market price, but they don't view that as a big impediment at the very beginning of developing a technology. These horizontal bands, they're mining in much the same way that people are mining fracking. It's called horizontal drilling, and essentially what they're doing is pumping steam in there that melts the ice. The ice turns into water, which is fine, of course, in the ocean, and the methane then goes back into a gas and travels up the tube and into the well. And when I talk to the Japanese engineers, they're quite confident they can work out they're moving very methodically. They're quite confident they can work out the bugs in this procedure, and they believe that they will have it at roughly commercial prices by 2018, which is 5 years from now. It's not that long. Even if they're ambitious and overly ambitious, to say it would be here to have a huge supply of natural gas in 10 years would be a really enormous game changer.
Why do they think that this technology can come to scale and come to profitability so quickly when supposedly companies have been working on renewables like solar and wind and some of the others for decades now, and they say, oh, well, we can't promise that we're going to have so much energy from these because it's not economic? Is this just the difference between the substances, or is this a decision that human beings are making, maybe because it's easier to make a profit from natural gas than it is from the sun?
Something of both, I think. Natural gas, petroleum has a greater, what they call energy density, than something like solar or wind. It's, so to speak, you can take a little bit of natural gas and produce more energy than you can from a roughly equivalent bit of the sun or the wind. I know that sounds ridiculous. We understand where I'm coming from. So that's easier to work with. The second thing is there's already a natural gas infrastructure. My home has gas in the stove. Millions of homes all around the world are already heated by gas or use gas. It doesn't require the great changes to the energy grid that solar and wind do, which require, in addition to developing the resource itself, a completely new way of redoing the energy supply of the country.
Go back to the geopolitics a little bit, if you will. Your article kind of opens with Churchill, doesn't it?
Yes, Winston Churchill.
That one.
And
Tell me where he comes in.
well, Winston Churchill, I learned this much to my surprise, is a central figure in the history of energy. And the reason is that more or less he decided by himself that English ships could no longer be fueled by coal, and they had to be fueled by oil, which has greater energy density. It's so hard to refuel huge amounts of coal in the ocean that something like 20% of the British ships, we're talking about the period of time about 1900, 1910, were always back at the harbor getting reloaded with coal, whereas oil you can put in big tankers and pump it. It's quite easy to do. So he said the Royal Navy has to fuel by oil. And the problem is that England had abundant supplies of coal, but next to no oil. And so that meant they had to, as he put it, secure an oil supply, which meant Britain got very, very much up to its eyeballs in involvement in the Middle East. Other people followed, and pretty soon you had the kind of tangled, toxic geopolitics of the Middle East that we see today.
So when are we going to see this developed in the United States so that it's going to be on our lips every day and not just on the cover of the Atlantic as a futurist article?
Well, it depends. Right now, we seem to have abundant supplies of natural gas from fracking. Now, that may be greatly restricted from the kind of environmental worries that we talked about. If that's the case, the engineers that I talked to believe that we would see something in 10 or 15 years. That's not that far away, as you may recall. 10 or 15 years ago, I did a story actually about the future of energy supplies for another magazine, and people told me about hydraulic fracking, which is the name for fracking, and it just said, oh, that's so far away, but here it is today, upending the entire world's energy picture.
So we could be free of entanglements in the Middle East, at least for this purpose?
Well, I don't think so. I think that once Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, I don't think we're going to be free of entanglements in the Middle East. What will happen is that many of the countries there, which depend almost exclusively on oil revenues, are suddenly going to have a much harder time funding themselves.
Charles Mann, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Up next, our Public Intellectual series measures discrimination without racism. It's not what you know, it's who you know. That old adage is familiar to job seekers. But what does it say about our society, particularly one that prides itself on upward mobility through merit? Time for our regular segment, Public Intellectual, where we look at research that can change our thinking and public policy. This week we learned something about how people really land jobs in America. Nancy DiTomaso joins us. She is the author of a new book, The American Non-Dilemma, Racial Inequality Without Racism. DiTomaso is Vice Dean for Faculty and Research and a Professor of Management and Global Business at the Rutgers Business School. Welcome to our program. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you interviewed 200 subjects.
246, actually.
From New Jersey, Tennessee, and Ohio.
Yes.
All of them white.
Yes, I purposely talked to whites between the ages of 25 and 55. One of my reasons for doing that is because there is so much data out there already, quantitative data, survey data, that looks at racial attitudes, all kinds of issues about racial inequality. And essentially that type of study had reached an impasse because people were using exactly the same data and coming up with contradictory findings. So I wanted to get more qualitative understanding of how people live their lives and how they tap into social resources and end up where they are in their lives in terms of jobs and economic well-being.
So you were looking to measure how favoritism rather than racism disadvantages black job applicants. Did you have a working definition of favoritism?
Well, yes. The way that I measured it in this particular study was 3 types of help that people might get. that is beyond the normal process. One is getting information that other people don't have, like when a job is available, getting influence, someone who would say, this is my friend, help them, or someone who could actually offer them an opportunity, give them a job or direct them to a good project or something like that.
And did you have a hypothesis?
Well, when I started this study, I was not necessarily looking for favoritism. What I was looking for is how people develop their access to good jobs and how they thought about issues of inequality and fairness given that. But what I began to hear very early on when I was doing these interviews was someone would say, oh, well, my neighbor who lived next door had this company and they agreed to hire me. Or I went on an interview and I looked down the hallway and I saw someone I graduated from high school with, and this person came over and said, this is my friend, take care of them. So I began to focus in on that particular issue. And in doing so, I tried to follow up as I was getting the job histories of the people that I talked to. And how did you get that job? Then what happened? Did you happen to know anyone? And so on. And when I did that, I was startled myself that, that as you can see from this particular graphic, that 70% of the jobs that the people that I talked to had over their lifetimes included some kind of help like this.
So explain that graph to us
sure.
a little more.
The numbers
can see it.
Yes, the numbers at the bottom is the first job, the second job, the third job, et cetera, up to the 10th job. Not every person had 10 jobs, so the numbers would change as you go through the life cycle. But the percentage is the percentage of my interviewees, the 246 people that I talked to, that got some kind of help, either information, influence, or opportunity in getting their first job, their second job, and so on. And as you can see, that in this particular case, this is looking at working class versus middle class interviewees. There really isn't a class difference.
Yeah, not that much.
No.
Those lines keep crossing each other.
Right, they do.
So they're in the same narrow range.
Right, it starts out very high, approximately 60%, and it goes up to about 70%.
And I think we have another chart here that separates by gender.
Yes, and there is a gender difference, and as you can see that the average for women is about 60%, again, over the lifetime. The average for men is around 75%. And my explanation for that difference is that women's jobs are less likely to pay a family wage, and therefore you don't need to draw on social networks as much for jobs that don't matter as much.
And maybe there's just still less of a history of women in the workplace, so there's less of a network of women to have connections with.
It could be, but I think it has to do with the quality of the job.
But what about race? Don't you have a denominator problem here? Because you can compare men to women because you did, but all your subjects were white. So how do we know that for black people or other non-whites, you wouldn't have the same kind of percentages?
Well, I think that, that you probably would have for blacks or for any kind of group, you're going to have people who will help try to use social networks to help position themselves. But all the data that we have suggests that whites are much more likely to hold higher level jobs, higher paying jobs, jobs with higher skill. And so the fact that whites are much more likely to find jobs through these, 70% of the jobs over their lifetimes through these kinds of social networks suggests that there is an impact on inequality given this process.
So really what you've discovered is that assuming that these curves would be unequal, you're showing just how much of the job applicants' connections and process toward getting a job in the white community comes at least to some degree via these connections, because that whole range was high, 60%, 70%.
Yes, it starts high and it gets higher. And the critical thing, though, about this is that all of the research and literature, public policy that addresses issues of racial inequality, inequality in general, frames it in terms of discrimination and racism. It's whites doing bad things to black people, or whites who are holding on to hostility toward blacks, and that if we could just get rid of these things, we would then not have racial inequality. But what I found in looking at these processes is that it isn't whites doing bad things to black people. It's whites doing good things for other whites.
Hence the subtitle of the book,
Right.
Racial Inequality Without Racism.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And how about
the-
the main title of the book, The American Non-Dilemma?
Non-Dilemma.
What's a non-dilemma?
Yeah. The title of the book is intended to allude to a famous book that was written in 1944 called The American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal, in which he argued that America would resolve its problems of racial inequality because there would be a moral dilemma because of the incompatibility of our egalitarian values and the growing understanding of the existence of racial inequality. And my book is trying to explain why that hasn't taken place, why whites don't have a moral dilemma about the existence of racial inequality. And my answer to that is that because inequality gets reproduced by whites helping other whites, they aren't doing bad things to black people, and therefore they don't think of themselves as contributing to problems of racial inequality. They think it has nothing to do with them, it must have something to do with blacks themselves.
Now, we should point out that these interviews were conducted in 1999
Yes.
and 2000,
Yes.
and yet the book is just out this spring.
Yes.
So how relevant do you think those interviews are and your data are for today?
Well, of course, I think that it's very relevant. In 1999, 2000, when I was doing the interviews, of course, the economy was booming. And now the economy is not booming, and there are a lot of people looking for jobs. So if there were 70% of the jobs that people were obtaining over their lifetimes in a booming economy, you would think it would be even more so.
Although hopefully each decade that goes by sees more diversity in higher education, therefore more diversity at higher level jobs in many, many workplaces, and that this effect would erode over time. And in 13, 14 years, we would see some diminution. Would that not be your hypothesis if you were going to go out and test it today?
Well, actually, the data don't necessarily show that, unfortunately.
There are data?
Yes. A friend of mine just came out with a book a few months before mine called Documenting Desegregation, which looked at data from workplaces from the EEO-1 reports, which is the data that is reported to the government regarding job distributions. And that book looked from 1966 to 2005 and basically found that desegregation for black men ended about 1980. And at anything now, we're resegregating workplaces. Desegregation for white women continued very slowly until about 2000 and then began to level off. So there isn't evidence to suggest that we are on a trajectory to change things.
Are there specific industries where you would say that's an exception? Because there are certainly workplaces and maybe whole industries where they have outreach programs, where they find diversity to be beneficial to the business bottom line, if for no other reason.
Yeah, let me give you two answers to that question. In this book that I mentioned, Documenting Desegregation, not my book, but another one, they found that in professional jobs, which require educational credentials, that there was less likely to be the kinds of growing inequality problems than for jobs where it has to do with somebody just making a decision about who to hire. So credentials matter. The second response that I would give to you about that, though, is that I recently had an opportunity to hear from a CEO of a major corporation who was very committed to the issues of diversity and believed very, very strongly that the success of his company depended on changing the composition of the managerial class, particularly in his firm. And yet this particular firm actually rewarded people for recommending their friends. And so here's someone who's committed to changing the composition, who has a workforce policy that is going to, if there's no attention to how people get recommended and chosen for jobs, they're going to reproduce their existing workforce.
Why would a company have a policy that rewards workers for recommending their friends?
Well, they do it because they believe that, that it will make their current workforce more loyal. that their friends will know people who have good skills. All of that is true, but it's also likely that their friends, that they will know people who are like them, and that it will be people within the same set of networks. And so if the company is really committed to diversity and to having a different kind of population in middle management, they would need to attend to that policy.
So let me read to you a comment from an employer in the comment section underneath your New York Times op-ed
Sure.
on
There were
this
lots of
topic.
them, yes.
Lots of them. And this particular employer wrote, when a valued and trusted employee comes to you with the name of a colleague, perhaps someone they've worked with in the past, and vouches for them, it rightfully carries some weight. For one, their own reputation is on the line, and if the person doesn't work out, it will reflect poorly on them. Secondly, if someone has worked with a person in the past, they will have a much deeper understanding of their capabilities and work ethic than could be reliably discerned through the normal screening process. And if you accept that, then it makes rational sense for an employer to want employees gotten in this way.
Well, if one believes that, then that might be the conclusion. But let me suggest two things that would suggest that maybe that isn't in fact an accurate representation. One is that at the outset of the passing of the civil rights movement, workplaces were very much of the sort where people passed along jobs to their children, to their nephews, to their relatives. That was not necessarily hiring the best people. There's sons, daughters, nephews, etc., may or may not be as qualified as someone else. So certainly there would, if there's a broader search, you might in fact find better employees. And then the second thing is that there is probably a public policy issue if people are passing along jobs that essentially don't belong to them. I mean, when I did this study, I found that in large companies, in small companies, in public agencies, in companies that touted being an equal opportunity employer, people were still hiring their friends, their relatives, their neighbors, etc., even though all these policies exist to prevent that from taking place. And again, it's not necessarily the case that hiring that way will get you a better employee. It may or may not, but it certainly is not good for society, I believe.
So you're talking about corporate policies. Do you see
corporate policies and public policies?
Well, do you see a public policy implication from these findings? Is there something the law should do? Is there something regulation should do, in your opinion?
Well, of course, I think that the passage of affirmative action policies essentially were a reflection of the fact that when we passed the Civil Rights Act, not much changed. We passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and employers didn't change their behavior because no one was paying attention to the outcomes. And that's why affirmative action policies were instituted a couple years later. And now that there's very little enforcement of those kinds of guidelines, we have, what my friends are finding is that we're having a resegregation in many kinds of jobs because when no one is paying attention to how they're making choices and what kinds of decisions they're making, they will tend to see people who are like themselves as being more competent because that's how they will evaluate their own competence, and they will tend to feel more comfortable with people that are closer to their own background, and then you will have a reproduction of the kinds of inequality that we currently have, and I don't think that's a good thing.
And as you know, I'm sure, the Supreme Court is currently deciding on a University of Texas affirmative action in higher education case. I think they have a University of Michigan case in the pipeline for next year. Do you see those as relevant to these, even though they're in education and not directly in the workplace?
Yes, of course I do think it's relevant because there's an assumption somehow that that companies should be able to employ whoever they want and that universities should have very specific guidelines in terms of who they should admit. It's clearly the case, not clearly the case, but there's a case to be made for there being better educational outcomes with a diverse student body. I think there are better societal outcomes when we have a more broadly educated population And so I believe affirmative action belongs in universities. And similarly, I think for workplaces that if we care about creativity and innovation and about a better outcome for the economy, I think having a more diverse workforce across the spectrum of jobs and industries will lead to those kinds of outcomes.
Last thing then, are you fatalistic about this? Because these data and the long scope of time that we've been talking about, since the Civil Rights Act was passed, would seem to indicate that this pattern is very resistant to change.
No, I'm certainly not fatalistic. When Myrdal wrote his book in 1944, he essentially made an appeal to whites to join social movements and to use institutions and legislation to lead to social change. And I think that my effort in writing this book is to call attention to these issues, essentially to kind of create the moral dilemma that Myrdal had hoped for, that otherwise I think does not currently exist.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, is there really a shortage of highly skilled tech workers, or is it all about visas for cheap labor? There's a high-tech war going on in Washington over immigration reform. Silicon Valley, with Mark Zuckerberg's Forward.us political action group leading the charge, is petitioning Congress to raise H-1B visa limits in order to address what they see as a stifling, high-skilled worker shortage in this country. This year's limit of 85,000 such visas was reached in just 5 days, 2 months earlier than last year. But others claim that Congress is about to give away almost half these jobs to guest workers right when Americans need them most. And still others believe the entire argument is baloney, that there is no shortage of high-skilled workers in the United States, that tech companies are just addicted to cheap labor. Joining us via Skype to figure out where the truth lies, Rutgers professor Hal Saltzman, who recently published a report on the high-skilled labor market, and Eric Grimmelman, executive director of the New York Technology Council, an industry group in our studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Hal, I'll start with you. What types of visas does the tech industry seek more of? How do they work exactly?
Well, they're looking for primarily H-1B visas, which allow workers to come over for 3 years and then renewed for up to 6 years on a temporary basis to be employed in the U.S. There are also several other visa categories that get used. The L visa, and we're called the OPT extension for recent graduates. So amongst all the different visa categories, it appears that about half of new hires may be coming out of these guest worker programs.
And you represent tech sector businesses in the New York area?
Individuals and businesses.
Do you see a shortage of high-skilled labor for your companies?
Our members report across the board that there is a shortage. They're experiencing it.
In what areas exactly? What kinds of jobs categories?
Broad categories, programmers, other engineering fields, designers, computer-oriented mostly.
And how reliant have companies in the United States become on offshore labor?
Well, they seem to be for certain areas, certainly for in services, seem to be very reliant. A lot of the operations are offshore, and they require a certain number of their team to be onshore to work with their customers. So there's this relationship between maintaining an offshore operation and having some workers onshore. So that's the relationship between the guest workers here and offshore operations.
Eric, are you part of this coalition that we referred to with Mark Zuckerberg looking for more H-1B visas for skilled workers?
We are not part of that coalition formally. We do support immigration reform broadly to help alleviate the shortage of STEM workers here. We also believe that in the longer term, this isn't the answer, that we need much better education and more STEM workers here.
And just so people know, that term STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. What do you say to this charge that some people are making now, that there isn't really a shortage of qualified Americans? What there is a desire for the cheaper labor that immigrants represent, because when they come here on H-1Bs, they're willing to work for less money.
Well, if there are more workers available, then wages will, to some degree, be depressed. That's basic economics. But Among the New York tech companies, they're having trouble finding the workers they need at prices they can afford or believe they can afford. And I'm seeing the same thing across the country, talking to other technology councils across the country. Recently we got together, and this seems to be a universal experience.
Hal, make your case that it's not the way Eric just described it.
Yeah, no, I sympathetic, I think, as Eric said, that, finding workers at the price you want may be difficult. But when we look at the wage trends over the last 10, 15 years, we find that wages today throughout the IT sector are about where they were in 1998, 1999. That after the dot-com bust, wages fell precipitously and have never recovered. So the puzzle to us, I think he said, Econ 101 is that if there's a shortage, you expect wages to go up. And we just don't see that. If you look at wage trends, they've been flat, any way you cut it, for about 10 years. And we also find that our colleges are producing, twice as many STEM workers overall. And in computer science, they graduate about 50% more graduates than find jobs in the IT field. And we had one longitudinal survey done by the Department of Education. And when they asked the students who didn't take an IT job, who graduated in computer science, why, about a third said there were no jobs available, and half said they found a better job elsewhere. So, it's a bit of a mystery to us to hear the complaints, because we hear them as well, and yet not see wages respond to normal market functioning of increasing wages if there's really a shortage.
So, Eric, do you not see that data reflected in the experience of the companies you represent?
They're reporting something different. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal this morning listing the 10 highest paid categories of college graduates this year. And 1 through 9 were engineering fields. Number 10 was finance, and I'd claim that finance requires a math background and therefore counts as STEM. So those are the most in-demand jobs if one's going to take wages as an indicator of that.
So what about all those STEM graduates who actually aren't finding work in their fields? What do you make of that?
Well, part of it could be that technology moves so quickly that just getting a degree in one area doesn't necessarily qualify you to have the skill you need. 5 years ago, there were no apps, and now everyone wants an app. And so app developers are in short supply. That may be what people are looking for. And so if one gets a degree in STEM, one also has to learn to self-educate and adjust, because what you learned 5 years ago isn't going to be what you need today.
Is that the case with the companies in your council? They're all looking for app developers, and that's not what people are graduating with skills for?
Some of them are. You're starting to see programs educate people in STEM. The academic institutions are trying to adapt. I'm an adjunct here at CUNY, and there's a new program in big data. Basically, it's a master's in data analytics. It's in the School of Professional Studies, which is the more applied end of things, trying to help prepare people for the jobs that are out there and going to be out there.
Does that ring true to you, Hal?
Well, I think that's exactly, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think he's making exactly the case, which is when you have fast-moving technology, industry needs to work with universities to have those skills. But that's very different. That's the right solution. The guest worker solution is the wrong solution, because what puzzles me is you're less likely to find those kinds of skills in students coming from offshore universities where there's less industry experience, less experienced faculty. So the puzzle is, if what you're looking for are these cutting edge skills, the best and the brightest, why you would be trying to increase the flow of guest workers who are less likely to have those skills. Investing in U.S. colleges, working with students seems to be very effective. And we have examples. One is petroleum engineering, where there really was a shortage because of retirees and new exploration. Wages shot up, and the students almost tripled the number of graduates, all from the domestic pool of students. So every time we look where there's a demonstrable need and industry raises wages, students respond in droves. So the market seems to work, and we puzzled as to why there's this interest in trying to distort the market, to ask for more government intervention to increase supply, rather than let the labor market work as it should, which is when industry really needs something, they can invest in training, raise wages, and the supply seems to be ample when they do that.
So why shouldn't it work that way? And it falls on the companies you represent to train people who may be coming out of colleges in this country with very good degrees, but ones that might, need some particular training for the particular skills of the moment, still applicable to what they majored in.
Many of our members are smaller companies, and they don't have the resources to do a lot of training. They need to find somebody, if they're a startup, who can be productive right away. And I think there's another question here, which is not just how is the pie divided up, but how to make the pie bigger. And entrepreneurship and innovation are the keys to growing the economy. And it's crazy for us to be sending foreign workers back home after they've gotten an advanced degree here. Let's have them stay here and start a company and grow more jobs, and better for everybody.
And how one of the arguments for that is the record that half of U.S. tech and engineering firms, from the stats that I have here, were founded by foreign-born people in this country, including Sun Microsystems and Google and PayPal and SpaceX and Tesla Motors. So if immigrants produce 3 times as many patents and start more businesses, then maybe there's something to be gained here for the number of jobs as well as for the national economy.
Well, it's an important distinction to go in a little bit into that, which is we make the distinction between the domestic workforce, which are immigrants, natives, citizens, permanent residents, versus guest workers, who are those who are brought in on temporary non-immigrant visas. And that's a very different population. The examples you gave are people who came over as immigrants but grew up here, came through the education system, were very much part of the U.S. Labor pool and education pool. Also, most of those were co-founded with natives. But the more important point is a broad immigration policy certainly is a way to strengthen the country, but a guest worker program that tries to bring in temporary non-immigrant workers undercuts wages and in fact undermines the very strength of the STEM workforce and undermines all the kinds of benefits that we gain from a diverse, and a strong immigration policy. So it's really works in just the opposite direction, focusing on a guest worker program as opposed to an immigration policy.
Now, let's see, is that a German Shepherd or a Labrador Retriever that came in on a special pet visa?
Sounds like it's a independent husky outside.
All right, they can see Russia from their house, no doubt. So on the way out the door, just tell us very briefly, each of you, what you would like to see in this emerging immigration bill in Washington with respect to this issue. Eric?
I'd like to see a very broad approach. I'd like to see more H-1B visas. I'd like to see workers with advanced degrees being able to stay here. I'd like to see more emphasis on STEM education here. I think we need to look at this very broadly and try to grow the pie as much as we can, and that's from innovation, and the more diversity we can get in our workforce, the more innovation we're going to see.
Hal, the last word, same question?
Well, I think one other point, by the way, is that about 2/3 of all graduates stay, and they've been doing that for the last 2 decades. There's no indication of any change. So we're not sending, higher advanced STEM graduates home, and I think that's a misnomer. But more to the point, I think we need to understand what the nature of this demand is. So we would call for transparency, where firms have a shortage, that we can see the data. Let's open it up as we do in the financial markets. We require some auditing and understand what the nature of the shortage is, rather than just rushing in to flood the labor market and continue to depress wages. Let's really understand where they're having problems. Is it recruitment? Is it training? Does it require different kinds of investment? But this blanket, open up the labor market, let's flood it with guest workers, and we've seen the result of keeping down prices or keeping down wages, doesn't strengthen the workforce. It's in nobody's interest to do that.
Thank you both very much. Now go feed your dog.
Thank you very much.
Next up, when the long arm of the law reaches out for your online life, who's got your socially networked back? So it hasn't taken long for the internet to become an indispensable tool for communicating with one another, but how much protection from the reach of government have we given up for this miracle of instant interaction? Turns out it depends on which network you are being social on. Facebook, Google, Twitter, whatever. Which firms are willing to shield your data when the long hand of the law comes knocking, legitimately or not? The EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, tracks who's got your back. Senior staff attorney Marcia Hoffman joins us via Skype from San Francisco. Hi, Marcia. Hello from New York.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on.
So what kinds of internet companies did you measure for this study?
Well, so we have this report called Who Has Your Back, which we've put out for each of the last 3 years. And what we do is we take a look at various companies' practices and see which ones stand up for their users when the government comes knocking. And when we first started looking at these companies several years ago, we chose major ISPs, major email service providers, major social networking services. We've also added cloud storage providers, major internet services that track location, and most recently, blogging platforms.
And why should people be skeptical of government seeking data? This conversation comes shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing, when we learned that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was looking at jihadi websites, for example, that helped to radicalize him. So why isn't this a good thing? And if we're not doing anything, we don't have anything to fear.
Well, increasingly, we are storing a lot of our information with third-party services, including a lot of very personal information. And when you are storing your emails and your private documents and interacting with your social circle on the internet, basically your privacy is increasingly guarded or not guarded by the companies that you choose to do business with. And there are plenty of reasons why the government might have a legitimate interest in collecting certain information from these companies, like in a legitimate criminal investigation or a legitimate counter-terrorism investigation. But there are also situations where the government overreaches. And we wanted to measure which companies do the best job pushing back against overreaching by the government and protecting their users when the government comes knocking and issues government demands that might be a little bit suspicious looking.
So we're going to put up on our screen your chart, your Who Has Your Back chart. And I don't know if you can see this as we're looking at it, but it looks like an alphabetical list of well-known tech companies, starting with Amazon and Apple and AT&T, et cetera, et cetera. The orange stars are good?
Yes, those indicate that the company does the best practice that we're measuring in that category.
So Apple, terrible. AT&T, terrible. What are we looking at, these one-star companies?
So maybe I should tell you a little bit about the categories that we measure.
Good.
We chose these categories 3 years ago when we started this, and at the time, there was at least one company performing this best practice in each of the categories that we chose. And so we knew that this was not impossible. A company could do each of these things, and it wouldn't be the end of the world, right? So the first category is requiring a warrant for content. This is actually a category that we added just this year. It's our one new category this year, so that basically if the government comes to an internet company wanting the content of a user's communications, they have to have a warrant and not some lesser standard, or the company won't turn it over.
Right, and let's go through these pretty quick because our time is short. I see category 2 is tells users about government data requests. So that's self-explanatory. Then publishes transparency reports. Google was a leader in that, right?
Right, Google was the first to do it.
Then publishes law enforcement guidelines, meaning what? They tell law enforcement what they consider acceptable in terms of requesting data from their users?
Meaning that they publish so that their users know the hoops that they expect the government to jump through when the government is seeking user information. So that process is transparent to the user and isn't some secret black box.
And the last two are fights for users' privacy rights in courts, and then fights for users' privacy rights in Congress. So at least Apple and AT&T do that last one. I want to scroll down to the T section of the alphabet because, well, look at Twitter. You've got yourself a 6-star company there. Is Twitter leading the pack?
Twitter and Sonic.net are the two companies that earned all 6 stars this year. So yes, I would say those two companies are leading the pack.
In what way? Why Twitter over Google or over Facebook? I mean, in a way, all these companies want us to social network with the people we know in slightly different ways.
Right, and obviously each company has to make its own decisions about how it wants to run its business. But basically, we have selected 6 categories that we think indicate best practices when it comes to interacting with your users on the internet. And Twitter and Sonic.net are the two companies that satisfied all of the criteria. Google is lacking a star in the category, tells users about government data requests unless prohibited by law. And Facebook is missing some stars as well. And so, basically our goal is to give public kudos to the companies that we think are doing a great job. And we think that based on the categories we've chosen, Twitter and Sonic.net are doing better than others.
So is this a recommendation for people who are concerned about their privacy and yet want to share stuff, because that's what social networking is about, to share on Twitter rather than on Facebook or something else, or once they are sharing it out into the public space, then this is all beside the point anyway?
Well, so, the way that I look at this is information that helps to educate consumers. And to the extent that consumers care about privacy and want to choose to work with companies that take steps to protect user privacy and are transparent with the public about their practices, this gives them information that helps them to make that decision. And if it's something that a user doesn't care that much about, if privacy is not something that's so important to a consumer, then this is information they don't have to take into account. But I think it's important to remember that services are different. They have different amounts of public information and private information, and our goal here was to illuminate and actually spotlight the companies that are doing the best in terms of being upfront with their customers and taking an aggressive stand against government requests that might be a little bit overreaching.
We just have a few seconds left. Do you think this report and others like it are having an impact? Are companies looking at your rating and saying, uh-oh, we better get better at this?
I do think so, and the reason why is because this is the 3rd report that we've put out, and every year more companies have gotten more stars. And the first year Google was the only company publishing a transparency report, and Twitter was the only company publishing law enforcement guidelines. These are practices that have become, I would say, industry standard at this point. Most of the companies in our report are doing these things now.
All right.
And I think
well,
that
thank you
is
so
impressive.
much for sharing all this with us.
Thank
It's
you.
great to see you doing this work. And that's our program for this week. We premiere a new show every Wednesday evening at 7:30. Next week, Mideast scholar Vali Nasser on Syria. And tune into my radio program weekdays 10 a.m. till noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, the science of marijuana. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.